Lauren thought her missing packages were just a delivery mistake until she caught Greg Martin, the HOA president, stealing them right from her mailbox. But what seemed like petty theft was just the tip of something much darker. Greg had been forging fines, manipulating mail, and pocketing thousands from innocent homeowners armed with hidden camera footage and undeniable evidence. Lauren took a stand, setting off a chain of events that no one saw coming. But just wait until you hear how this HOA tyrant was finally brought to justice, and how one missing package exposed it all. Lauren didn't think much of it at first. Packages got lost all the time. Wrong address, lazy delivery drivers, or maybe some random porch pirate passing through the neighborhood. It was annoying, sure, but not unusual. She filed a claim with the shipping company and chalked it up to bad luck. But then her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who spent most of her time tending to her flower beds, leaned over the fence one afternoon with a puzzled look. "I saw a man take one of your packages yesterday, dear. Looked like that HOA fellow Greg, I think his name was Lauren." Blinked. Greg Martin, the head of their homeowners association. That couldn't be right. Why on earth would he be taking her mail? At first she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some mix-up. Maybe the package was misdelivered and he was just being neighborly. But something about the way Mrs. Thompson had said it, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be telling her at all, sent a prickle of unease down Lauren's spine. By the time she got home that evening, the discomfort had settled into something heavier. She started thinking back. This wasn't the first time a package had gone missing over the last few months. Little things had disappeared. Subscription boxes, online orders, even official-looking letters that she'd been expecting but never received. She had blamed the postal service. But what if she had been wrong? That night, she sat on her couch scrolling through her security options. Eventually, she settled on a discreet, motion-activated camera small enough to tuck near her porch without drawing attention. The next morning, she had it mounted just above her mailbox, and then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. That evening, as she was finishing up dinner, her phone buzzed with a motion alert. Lauren clicked the notification, expecting to see a delivery driver or maybe a stray cat wandering by, but instead there he was. Greg, her breath hitched as she watched the screen. He wasn't just passing by, he was standing at her mailbox, glancing left and right as if checking for witnesses. Then, in one smooth motion, he reached inside, pulled out a small brown package, tucked it under his arm, and walked away, calm, confident, like he had every right to it. Lauren's pulse pounded in her ears. Why was he stealing her mail? How long had this been going on? And more importantly, what else was he hiding? Lauren knew better than to act impulsively. It was tempting. Confront Greg, shove the footage in his face, demand answers, maybe even send everything straight to the HOA board. But a nagging feeling told her this was bigger than just a few stolen packages. If she wanted the full picture, she had to be smart. So she watched for the next several days. Lauren kept a close eye on Greg whenever she could. She noted routines, paid attention to where he went, and started noticing patterns. What she saw unsettled her more than she expected. Greg wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president enforcing neighborhood regulations with an iron fist. He was deliberate, systematic. He moved through the community with purpose, checking certain houses and ignoring others. She saw him linger at specific properties, sometimes standing in driveways as if taking mental inventory. But what disturbed her most was what he did with the mail. It wasn't just hers. Greg had a habit of stopping at various mailboxes, pretending to inspect them like he was performing some kind of official HOA duty. But then he'd casually slip open the lid, flip through the letters inside, and sometimes pocket one or two before walking away. Lauren's stomach tightened. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't a good Samaritan picking up misdelivered mail. Greg was stealing, but why? What was he looking for? One afternoon, she watched from her window as he stopped at the Wilson's house across the street. He Didn't even hesitate, he reached inside their mailbox, pulled out a white envelope, looked at the return address, then wrote something down in a small, leather-bound notebook he always carried. Then, as if nothing had happened, he tucked the envelope under his arm and kept walking. Lauren felt her hands clench in a fist. Enough was enough. She needed to understand exactly what he was up to, so she dug into the HOA bylaws, scouring every document she could find. It didn't take long to uncover something interesting. Technically, as HOA president, Greg did have access to certain mailing records, official notices, resident complaints, financial reports, things related to his duties, but nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it say he had the authority to snoop through personal mail or remove anything from someone's mailbox. So what the hell was he doing? So suspicion burned in her chest as she compiled her footage, but she needed more. So she started talking to her neighbors. That's when the real picture started to emerge. At first, people were hesitant. No one wanted to start drama with the HOA. But once she showed them her footage, their stories came pouring out. The Millers had been fined for unauthorized modifications to their backyard deck, except they never received a single warning. The first notice they got was already a demand for payment. Mrs. Castillo had been cited for unpaid dues despite mailing her check 3 weeks early. Her bank record showed it was cashed, but the HOA ledger marked her as delinquent. The Parkers had been threatened with legal action over violating HOA parking policies, but when they went looking for the initial complaint, they realized they'd never received the letter. One by one, the stories lined up. People weren't just getting fined unfairly, they weren't even being given the chance to dispute it. Greg had control over all correspondence. If he withheld certain letters, lost payment confirmations, or forged notices, he could create violations out of thin air. And if residents were forced to pay fines they technically never owed, that money had to go somewhere. Lauren felt sick. Greg wasn't just stealing mail, he was running a scam right under their noses. The more she pieced together, the angrier she got. This wasn't incompetence, it was corruption. She compiled everything, footage, testimonies, financial discrepancies, and took it straight to the local police station. As she handed over the evidence, she took a deep breath. She didn't know where this would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: Greg had been abusing his power for long enough. It was time for someone to stop him. Greg wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president with an inflated ego. He was a criminal. As soon as the police got involved, things unraveled fast. What started as a simple complaint about stolen mail turned into something much bigger. Investigators combed through HOA financial records, subpoenaed emails, and reviewed security footage from multiple residents. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Greg had been running a full-scale scam. He wasn't just pocketing mail, he was forging official HOA documents, creating fake violation notices, and inflating fines that didn't actually exist. Homeowners were paying penalties for offenses they never committed, thinking they had no choice. But where did all that money go? Straight into Greg's pockets. By manipulating the flow of information, he had managed to funnel thousands of dollars in fees and late payments into personal accounts that had nothing to do with the HOA. Even more damning, some residents who had tried to dispute their fines had their appeals mysteriously lost in the system, likely because Greg had intercepted them before they ever reached the HOA board. And the best part, the HOA, the very organization that was supposed to hold him accountable, had been looking the other way for years. Greg had operated under the guise of maintaining order, acting as if he was just a strict leader, enforcing the rules. But once the evidence piled up, his entire narrative collapsed. When police confronted him, he tried to worm his way out. I was just making sure the community stayed in line. He claimed some people don't follow the rules. I had to take matters into my own hands. But when detectives laid out the bank statements, the forged due documents, and the security footage of him stealing from people's mailboxes, his excuses started to crumble. And that's when the Neighbors turned on him at the next HOA. Meeting the usually quiet, obedient crowd. Erupted people who had once feared Greg's authority were now shouting for his immediate removal. How much money did you steal from us, Greg? Someone demanded. Where did our fines actually go? Another neighbor snapped. HOA board members who had conveniently ignored Greg's shady behavior for years suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. We had no knowledge of these actions. The HOA president stammered. Greg acted independently, right? Lauren stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the fallout unfold for the first time. Greg didn't look like the smug, all-powerful HOA tyrant. He looked small, cornered because the truth was out, and now there was nothing could do to stop it. Greg's downfall wasn't just a legal matter, it was a public spectacle. The day of his arrest, the entire neighborhood seemed to be watching. A pair of patrol cars pulled up in front of his house just after sunrise, red and blue lights flashing against the pristine lawns and well-manicured flower beds. Officers knocked on his door, their voices firm but professional. It didn't take long for Greg to step outside, disheveled and pale, like a man who had spent the entire night realizing his time was up. He tried to keep his head high, but there was no hiding the sweat on his brow. Lauren stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching as the scene unfolded. Gregory Martin, you're under arrest for mail theft, identity fraud, and unlawful entry onto private property. A gasp rippled through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, others just stared in quiet satisfaction, watching justice finally catch up with the man who had ruled over them with an iron fist. Greg's mouth opened as if he was about to argue, to make one last desperate attempt to explain it all away, but what could he possibly say? That he was just enforcing HOA policies, that it was all a misunderstanding. The evidence said otherwise. Lauren had made sure of that. As the officers secured the handcuffs around his wrists, Greg finally looked at her. For months, he had looked down on her, treated her like a nuisance, dismissed her concerns as if she were just another resident who didn't understand how things worked. But now he looked at her like a man who knew he had lost. Lauren held his gaze, unmoving, unapologetic. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was already out. With a final shove, Greg was placed in the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, and moments later the vehicles pulled away, disappearing down the street. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath, the silence that followed, wasn't heavy, it was liberating. It was like a long-held breath had finally been released. Neighbors lingered outside, some shaking their heads, others exchanging knowing looks. It wasn't just Greg who had been exposed, it was the entire corrupt system he had built around himself. HOA members scrambled to distance themselves from him. We had no idea he was involved in any criminal activity, one board member claimed during an emergency meeting. We trusted him to manage the community's affairs properly. Another insisted, her voice trembling under the weight of guilt. But the truth was they had ignored the signs. They had let him operate unchecked, allowed him to control what letters reached homeowners, what fines were issued, and where the money went. And now they were trying to save themselves. Residents weren't buying it. At the next HOA meeting, they demanded a full restructuring, new leadership, new financial oversight, and most importantly, an end to the fear-based rule Greg had enforced. Then something Lauren didn't expect happened. A small group of board members approached her, looking uncertain but hopeful. Lauren, one of them, began clearing his throat awkwardly. We need someone who actually cares about this community, someone who's not afraid to call out corruption when they see it. Would you consider joining the board? Lauren blinked. For months she had been fighting just to get her stolen mail back. She hadn't planned on exposing a full-blown HOA scam, and she certainly never planned on getting involved in the politics of it all. But as she looked around at the relieved faces, at the homeowners who had finally found their voice, at the people who were no longer Afraid of what might happen if they questioned authority, she realized. Something this wasn't just about her mail anymore, this was about taking back control of the neighborhood. Elle let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. I just wanted my packages back. Then she smiled. But I guess I ended up doing a little more than that.